Casting with Ceri Jones.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's podcast. This week I thought I'd do something a little bit different. Over the years I fly fished obviously for trout in the main, but the last few years I've got into fly fishing for bass. I've done it numerous times over the years, one day here, one day there, usually with somebody who knows the marks, which is a big bonus. And usually it's been in the sea itself. But I've often gone during that time to rivers all across South Wales, all the way across up to Pembroke. And I've caught bass, which run up into the rivers. And I've had a few days then where fishing in the estuary, in the tidal stretches, and also in lagoons. But until recently, it's never really gripped me. It's great to have one day a year, and I've had reasonable success. But getting into this bass fishing has been a little bit of a forced accident. Because the last 2 years, I've been fishing, quite often, once a week, maybe twice a week. And it's all down to lockdown. Even though we were only supposed to be going local, a lot of the waters, the Welsh waters, were still out of bounds. So we couldn't fly fish for the trout. I thought, right, the next best thing, let's have a go up and do an odd day in the bass. And then I started catching, and I had a couple of more. During that time, the last 2 years, my confidence has grown. And each time you go, you learn something new all the time. So this episode is to try and answer a few questions which I regularly get, especially the last couple of weeks, because now is the peak time I have found. Towards the end of the trout season, sort of September, the bass fishing has been great. So, like I said, the last couple of weeks I've had so many messages and emails asking how do I do this, what flies do you use, and when do you go, and what tide. So, I don't profess to be a specialist bass fisherman, and there's plenty of people out there who've got a lot more experience than me. But I thought I'm going to share what I've learned over the last 2 years especially, and previous, and answer some of the questions which I am getting. Well, first of all, when it comes to tackle, the great thing with bass fishing, a good reservoir trout fishing outfit will work. Ideal. I use a 10-foot for 7/8 Gray's reservoir rod. It's actually a rod which has been around a while. It's called the Platinum X. And it's a powerful rod without being too stiff and heavy. Throws a good line. It's ideal. It's just a job for me. You can get 9-foot for a 9, so the length can be a little bit shorter or longer. But basically, you want something that can throw a decent line with a big fly. So, but that said, now the rod I've had is a 10-foot for a 7/8. Now, there's only 2 lines I use when I'm fishing for bass, and that's a floater and an intermediate, because rarely are you fishing anything deep. So, as regards the line choices, both lines I have are Airflow 40 pluses. The floater is an 8, and the intermediate is an 8. I'm sure, to be honest, the line ratings of some of the Airflow lines, especially the earlier ones, were heavier than what they actually say. Like the weight forward 8s of the 40 plus lines, which I've had for some time now, are more like a 9. Maybe there's a reason for that. Certainly throws out a good line. And the good thing about them is you only want one false cast and you can get your line out comfortably 25 yards. And if you're fishing like a river or an estuary, that really is what you're looking at. It'd be nice to, if there's a wider stretch to cast further, then that's the line to have. There are times when I fish a sink tip. I have a lovely Cortland sink tip, but it's not a line which I use so much for the bass. It's always handy to have in the bag. The areas I'm fishing, as I said, are tidal stretches across South Wales. I'm not going to say the waters, because there's quite a few anglers out there that wouldn't be too impressed. But what I can tell you, that the waters I do fish, which range from South Wales, Southeast Wales, all the way across to Pembroke, they're all more or less the same tactics I use. So you can take these tactics and use them to whatever water's local to you or whatever you're going to be fishing. Now on the business end, more often than not, most of my fish come to surf candies. No rocket science there, they've been around for a while. And various colours. The patterns I use, I've actually put photographs up to accompany this podcast. So you can look online to see them. So you can see exactly the patterns I'm using. More often than not, they're size 2 O'Shaughnessy's. And I'm using nickel-plated hooks. I do go as small as 8s even sometimes. But more often than not, they're quite large. I've seen much larger. And the patterns themselves, I usually have the tail at least twice the length of the hook. So it's a nice length to the tail. A little bit longer, to be honest. You can look at the fly patterns in the photographs which accompany this episode. And when it comes to leader, no frills there. £10 Maxima Green, not Chameleon. I know people use Chameleon, I don't know why. I've never got on with it. Now, when I started off, I was automatically, every time I'd go, I'd fish an intermediate. And which is fine, and I was catching fish. Nothing great to a certain extent, sort of £2 plus, good sport. There were certain areas where it was a little bit shallow in some of the places I was fishing. And snags. So I was losing flies, which is annoying because they take time to tie these surf candies. So I started using a floating line. And another thing, the good thing about the floating line is, which is something which I use all the time now, my first choice, is especially when you're fishing in the day, it's very visual. You see a load of mullet come up, and in amongst those mullet are the bass. So the fish are high up in the water. And a good thing is, what I do, I put a dropper on, a small, maybe shrimp pattern, or there's like a hare's ear variant which I use on the dropper, only a size 12, maybe 10. And by doing this, there's a chance of catching a nice mullet. This is my typical setup now. Surf candy on a point, a little shrimp on a dropper, fish on a floating line. There are times when the tide comes in, it brings in a lot of weed and crap on the surface. And if you're fishing a floater then it's a nightmare, because every cast you got weed on your line, and you've got to false cast a few times to get it off, or just literally just bring it in and pull the weed off every cast. And when this happens, it only happens about half the time really in the certain areas which I fish. Then I would go to an intermediate, and then you don't get no problem then, because your line and your flies are under. Now the areas I fish are tidal stretches, the lower reaches of the river. Now then, you need to take a look first of all at the tide tables of the areas you're going to be fishing. And you want to get there about whatever the high tide says time. Say that the high tide is 12 midday. Everyone, it's quite common knowledge, you say, all right, so fish it 2 hours before and 2 hours after high tide. Yeah, but that's not all the info you want to take in. Because what I've learned, so if the high tide is 12 o'clock, I want to be fishing not just 2 hours before, 2.5 hours before. And the reason for this is, what I found, the tide won't actually change. If you get there 2.5 hours before, and you're fishing, you're casting out, the current of the river is still taking your line down. So the momentum of the tide haven't started yet. This is 2.5 hours before. what I have found, at that lull point where your fly line just stops flowing to the sea, it's where the momentum of the tide is starting to come in. And there's a moment where it just, probably about 10 minutes or so, I'd say, where it's almost like fishing a still water. And it's that point, it's not 2 hours before, it's 2.25. And at that point, what I noticed, there are quite a few fish come in first. And then you see the anglers come in. And they've missed 15 minutes of fishing. Now, I've caught some of my better fish and good fish at this 15-minute point, the first ones that come in. So be prepared, get switched on and wait. And as soon as that water stops flowing, that's the time you're going to start catching. Then it's a little bit of a lull, maybe 20 minutes. And then you get the main run of fish then, which everyone knows about. But people think, that's the time to fish. But there are times right at the beginning which is worth fishing before. Now then, back last month, I did just this. And then it just went calm. And the water just stopped flowing. Just at the start of the turn, I waded out to this one spot. And it's quite a wide stretch of river. I would say 30 yards, you can see. But there's a spit that comes out halfway. So if you walk along that spit and fish the far side, but instead of casting straight across, I was cutting 45 degrees down. And even though the stretch of river, or the estuary, you can say rather, it's 30 yards wide, the area I'm fishing, and it's almost like a funnel, the fish will come up into a 10-yard, maybe 15 yards wide bit of water. So before the high tide actually comes up and makes it all fishable, where when the fish are coming in, it's got all the width of the river to run, and they come the whole width of the river then. But if you actually wade out halfway, understanding the terrain and the contours of the river, because the early fish, they can only go through this one channel. So that's your best bet. So what I was doing was casting out, and as soon I saw one movement just ahead, I covered him, and then I'd give one pull, and then figure of eight. As I started, it locked up. And all of a sudden, I was into a great fish, my best fish this year. I struck, and he just stayed there. Typical bass. They thrash and thrash, not necessarily run. I haven't a great fish which run, to be honest. But I struck into this fish, and he just stayed there thrashing on the surface. And then he leapt twice. And one thing that stays in my mind, I can see it now, the gills flare open. It looked like this fish was all head. And it was very similar to like a pike would do, when they're thrashing and tail walking. I did this twice before throwing the hook. Now I estimate that fish comfortably 10, 12 pound. Could have been quite a bit more. But that was the first fish, or one of the first fish, into the pool. Now, this has happened once or twice now, where the better fish, maybe coincidence, but, if it's happened, just be prepared for it. I did have smaller fish after, again, the 2 pound stamp. Before moving on, I went up the river then, further up, to see if there's a bigger fish up there then. But anyway, that's one key thing you want to learn. Be one of the first ones there. And when it comes to retrieve, again, I've heard so many people say, no, you got to fish slow for bass. And there's other people then, no, they like to chase and they like to rip the flies in. They'll either come on slow pulls or they'll come on a fast figure of eight. And recently, I'd say 90% of my fish come on a fast figure of eight. And you rarely lose or miss any then, because you're continuously in contact with the fly. Now, I'm probably rushing through this. There are different points which I could mention, but this is more of a guide for people who are wanting to get into the bass fishing. Now, one point as well I want to mention, a lot of people will say bass fishing is better at night. I haven't found that. I've had equally good fish in the day and numbers of fish as I have in the night. There are less people around at night, and to some people it's a lot more enjoyable, because the downside is when fishing a popular area in the day, there's dog walkers, there's swimmers, especially during the holidays, So if you can switch off in your head all that and just concentrate on the fishing, it's okay. But before I actually go on to, there's one thing I forgot to mention. Before I actually go on to fishing, differences between the day and the night. You fish the 2 hours, as I mentioned, up to high tide. And when high tide has come, you might as well just sit down on the bank. I haven't had any success when the high tide is up. Purely down, I think, because the fish have moved up. They've come up, and the areas you're fishing are quite high. The two choices you have then is walk up the river to the areas where it's more fishable and the likelihood where the fish have gone to, or you just sit back, make a cuppa, maybe with a gilly kettle, sit down, have a sandwich, and wait for the tide to turn again. Feel free to visit my online shop on my website, where you will find a selection of my most popular Irish sign prints, plus a choice of gilly kettles and cooking accessories. Or if you would like to experience one of my guiding and instruction packages, feel free to message me. Or again, take a look at my tuition and guiding page at castingwithCeriJones.com. Now, this is something which I've learned again. When the tide is turning, again, you know when it's turning, you just see the way the current is going back. And I find the early stages of when it starts to go back, it's not like at the start or when it comes in. There's fish coming in. It takes a while, I found, for the fish to actually come back to the sea with the tide. Now, so don't be in too much of a rush. As soon as your line starts to come around and the current is going back to sea, but just get ready, prepared, and start fishing. And it's when the last stages, I have found, most of the fish come back down. So get ready, and then you're fishing, and then you can see the levels coming down and down, almost to the river levels, the normal river level. At this point, again, you wait that 2 hours, and most people then think, all right, that's gone now, and they head off. But it's crucial. The number of fish I've had where the river level is more or less back to normal, and the current is flowing as usual back to the sea. And I've had times where I'm thinking, right, I'll give it another 10 minutes, another 20 minutes, just to see what happens. And the river sometimes is on its bones at this stage, back to this, as I said, back to this level. And then you get some great fish again. It's as if there's a big pot of fish, and they wait. They must enjoy it so much in the river. And when they realize, all right, we got to go now, and then they go at the last opportunity. And I've had fish doing that point as well. In fact, I mentioned on a previous podcast. So they're going over the story again, actually. If you look back at episode 47, when I have a chat with John Ossie at Chew Valley, I mentioned the story of this big fish which I hooked and took me to sea. I hooked into a fish. Nothing I could do. And it just went screaming off. It took all my fly line. It took about, 30 yards of backing or more, and kept on going to the sea. And I had to run down the beach after it. And in the end, it came off. I don't think for 1 minute that was a bass. I think it was a mullet, a big mullet, which took one of the dropper flies, which at the time was like as hair's-ear variant which I've had. So if you get a chance to have a listen to that story, it's at the start of the episode with John Horsey. So times is everything. It's trying to catch the fish. They never stay in one place. You either move with what you think the fish are doing, or stay in one place and just sit it out then until they come back. Now back to nighttime fishing. I have friends which religiously do the nighttime fishing, and they've come from a sea trout background. Now in Wales and most parts of the UK, sea trout angling is done at night. So they're used to fishing at night. And it's probably because, they get used to fishing at night and the bass come in and they catch in fish and they catch a big fish. But that's not to say they wouldn't have them in the day, because I've had them in the day. Most people fish at night down to one reason. They're working in the day and they can't go. But I had a great night last week. I was fishing this one pool and it was almost high tide. I started off at the mouth, you can say, of this one pool, and there were fish coming in. That's one thing again. You can't see the fish in the night. You can hear one or two, so you don't really know when they're coming in. But I fished it early on, as soon as the tide came in, and it was almost high tide now, and I could hear a commotion in front of me. And you could just make out like a silhouette against the distant lights of the town. And I could make out it was an otter. Now, usually when you see something like that in a pool, you think, oh, that's it. No, that's the fishing done for. There's two ways you can look at it. One, it's going to knock the fishing off, because the fish are going to think it's not interested about feeding. It just wants to survive and escape. Or the other way you can look at it, there's one reason the otter's in the pool, because there's fish there. And it's exactly what happened. Space of about 40 minutes, 50 minutes, I took 3 great fish. One about 2.5. It was a nice fish. And then shortly after, I took 2 great fish, which were like between 5 and 6 pounds each. And it's great catching a fish. There is an attraction with the dark. I can see it when you're throwing a line out. You feel the arc of the line going round in the current, and then stops. You lift, and instantly you hear that. You can hear the commotion. So there, that was one experience. And again, fast figure of 8. And I haven't found no difference in fly patterns or techniques for the night as for the day. No doubt over the next year or two, I will learn more. But more often than not, whatever I'm fishing in the day will work in the night. Well, I hope that's answered some of the questions which I've had. But to share what I've learned over the last couple of years, I hope it'll help. And if there's any other questions which I probably left out, message me. I'll see what I can do. If you've enjoyed listening to this bass episode, there are quite a few other podcast episodes which you might be interested in listening to. The first one, episode 4, with Vaughan Thomas, who was a Welsh saltwater fly fishing guide. And then there was episode 5, where he actually takes me then to a lagoon in Pembrokeshire, where it's a saltwater lagoon. It's almost like still water fishing, where the place is just full of bass and mullet. That was quite a day, and something I'd want to go back to do, actually. And after that, then you've got episode 7 with fish artist David Miller. He's very much a passionate bass fisherman. And then more recently, James Barry, an Irish fish scientist, and he talks about fly fishing for bass around his home in Waterford, fishing along the Copper Coast. So, in the meantime now, I'm going to sit down at the bench, tie a couple of flies, look at the tide table, and head out. Till next time, tight lines. If this is your first time tuning in, make sure you catch all future episodes by clicking subscribe via the links on my website, castingwithcerijones.com, or via iTunes or your favourite podcatcher. If you like what you've heard on this episode, feel free to drop me a line via my website. Tell me what you've enjoyed, ask a question, or better yet, tell me what you want to hear more of in the future. And if you're looking for additional tips, tackle reviews, or venue information, or just want to see what's been hit in the back of my net lately, search up Casting with Ceri Jones on Facebook or follow me on Instagram. And if you still want more, I'm regularly uploading video content onto the Casting with Ceri Jones YouTube channel, so just check that out and subscribe over there too. Wherever you follow, subscribe, comment or message, I look forward to catching up soon for a good fishing chat. Well, I think that's all for now, so until next time, tight lines and don't strike too soon.